good introduction and for allowing me to speak. My name is Freeman. I am the local historian over the local history genealogy department at the Florence Lauderdale Public Library. And can everybody hear me? Am I talking loud enough? BC's got me mic'd. He's going to record this and then we'll post it on the website in a week or two, or the Facebook page in a week or two. So this is a reworked version of this program that I first did like 15 years ago, but I've got a lot of new information on it. So hopefully if you saw it 15 years ago, it will be new to you. And it's called The James Gang Strikes Back, the 1881 James Gang Robbery on the Muscle Shoals Canal. Friday, March 11, 1881, U.S. Receiver of Materials Alexander George Smith was robbed of $5,290.18 in U.S. gold and greenbacks a few miles west of Lot 5 at Douglas's Gate on Douglas's Branch on the Muscle Shoals Canal by 3 unknown armed men. It was a rainy day. On Thursday, March 10th, Smith had been given a check number 45050 for $5,290.18 by Assistant Engineer H.J. Gallo to cash at Campbell & Company's bank in Florence. Smith, in his later deposition, says that he left Campbell & Company's bank at 11 a.m. and left Florence headed back to Blue Water that Thursday at 11:30 a.m. Well, Friday, the next day, March 11th, he was robbed. And several local papers reported the story. And you can see 3 of the local papers, the Lauderdale Times, the Tuscumbia North Alabamian, and the Florence Gazette report of the robbery. And under the headline, "Bold Highwaymen Get in Their Work." Nobody writes like that anymore. The Tuscumbia North Alabamian on Friday, March 18th, the first local paper to cover the story, because these are weekly newspapers, wrote, quote, "Last Friday, Mr. Alex Smith was robbed of $5,200 of government money on the Muscle Shoals Canal and within 2 miles of headquarters, which are at the mouth of Blue Water in Lauderdale County. He had been to Florence for the money and on reaching the point stated was overtaken by 3 men on horseback who surrounded him with their pistols leveled and took the money and his pistol. They permitted him to keep $40 or $50 of his own money and his watch, saying they only wanted the U.S. funds. They then compelled him to go with them through the woods about 20 miles, releasing him late in the night, not far from the Tennessee line. The following are descriptions of the robbers and their horses, and then they proceed to describe the robbers, which we'll get to in just a moment. And keep that timeline loosely in the back of your mind. This is an ad from the Lauderdale News of Wednesday, November 9th, 1881, for W.P. Campbell & Company bankers, where Smith had cashed his check given him by Assistant Engineer Gallo for the $5,200. And then this is a map from the 1888 Sanborn Fire Insurance maps of downtown Florence showing the location of Campbell & Company's bank on Court Square. If anybody is familiar with Florence and knows where the current county building is, the old First Southern building, that was the location of Florence's first 2 courthouses. And so just across the street was Campbell & Company Bank, where Smith retrieved the money. Well, this is a breakdown of the specifics of the money that he had stolen. He had 25 gold pieces at $20 each for $500, 245 silver dollars totaling $254, 200 silver pieces at 50 cents each, which made $100, 200 silver pieces at 25 cents each, to total $50. He had 5 and 10 cent silver nickels totaling $15.18. He had $1 and $2 bills totaling $66. He had 101 $5 bills to total $505. $1,300 in $10 bills, $2,000 of $20 bills, $500 of 50s, for a total of $5,290.18. Smith had kept out $50 of that money to pay 2 former employees in Florence. The paper currency was in a paper package in an inside coat pocket, or an inside pocket of Smith's inside coat. He had a coat and then an overcoat. The gold was in a small bag inside a larger bag containing the silver, which was secured to Smith's saddle and hidden by his overcoat. Smith was allowed to keep the balance of the $50, which was actually a part of his salary, and his watch, the robbers saying, according to Smith, that they only wanted the government money. Well, later Smith gave deposition. After the robbery on May 7th, he went and gave his affidavit to the court officials where he described what happened. And if you'll allow me to read a little bit from his deposition, Mr. Smith says, I reached Harkin's Quarry on the line of the Muscle Shoals Canal. Oh, and here's a printed out copy of the actual deposition that Smith gave, that local historian Ronald Pettis donated to the library. He donated the transcriptions of these affidavits. So that is Smith's affidavit. He says, I reached Harkin's Quarry on the line of the Muscle Shoals Canal about 3 p.m. Crossed 4 Mile Branch, and then for the first time saw 3 mounted men about 1/4 of a mile to my rear. I kept looking back occasionally, but they followed, keeping about the distance between us. On my reaching the commissary building near lock number 5, I stopped and waited until the men came up. They inquired the way to First Creek. I directed them and they passed on. When the men reached lock 5, a distance of about 400 yards, I started again. After seeing them when they passed the commissary building, I had concluded they were U.S. revenue officials, deputy marshals on duty, frequently passing along the line of the canal. I came up with them on the east side of Douglas Branch. The men stopped, appearing to hesitate, so I caught up with them. I went up the bank to the fence when I heard a peculiar noise behind me. I turned and saw each of the 3 men with a pistol pointed at me, they forming a kind of semicircle around me, and the fence barring my way in front, the gate not being open. They ordered me to throw up my hands, threatening to kill me if I hesitated. This demand being several times repeated, and evidently by desperate men, I had no choice but to comply. After throwing up my hands, they disarmed me, taking my pistol. While searching my vest pockets, they found the balance of the $50 after paying the laborers before mentioned. The robbers inquired if the money was government money or my own money. I told them it was mine, meaning that it would form a part of my salary. The robber told me he did not want it, neither did they take my watch. They said they only wanted government money. The robbers kept me under close armed watch the entire distance, one riding in front, one behind, and one alongside. We rode along in this manner until it quite was dark. When we stopped in a large hollow in the woods, it was raining at the time. At this point, they told me I was at liberty to go. On telling them I did not know which way to go, one of them gave me an old overcoat and told me the best thing I could do was to stay there all night. On the trip, one of the robbers gave me a card with the name, etc. penciled thereon, also a rawhide whip to use on my horse, unquote. And from his being abandoned near Center Star, Alabama that night, Mr. Smith wandered back into camp the next morning, having received food and fodder for his horse from several neighborhood residents. He passed the night at a German resident's home and then straggled back into camp at Blue Water the next morning. This is a colorized map of an 1890 engineer's map of the Muscle Shoals Canal. In red, you can see where the robbery actually occurred. You can see Florence is over here. Let me see if this pointer will work. Let's see what we get here. Yeah, this is Florence. So this is Shoal Creek. This is the canal headquarters at Blue Water. This is Lot 5 near Douglas Gate where the robbery happened. And then this is Nashville headed north. So I've got an actual black and white copy of the original of this on the table here that my colleague Jordan Collier used in a program he just did. So if you want to come and look at the original black and white of that, it's up on the table right there. This is a black and white slide of the original 1830s Muscle Shoals Canal that had been built and then discarded. Construction on the first of 2 Muscle Shoals canals, designed by French engineer Simon Bernard, was begun in 1831 and completed in 1836 at a cost of $644,594 and consisting of 17 locks. However, due to a limited approach at both ends of the canal, few boats used it, and this, coupled with a lack of additional funding, caused the whole project to be abandoned in 1838. Construction on Muscle Shoals Canal began again after the war in 1875 by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and it was finished in 1890 under Captain George W. Goethals, who has a historic marker on Wood Avenue for the Goethals house. Goethals later built the Panama Canal. He later said that in his estimation, the Muscle Shoals Canal project was a more significant feather in his cap than even the Panama Canal. During construction, several work camps had been set up about 4 miles apart over the whole length of the canal, and you'll see those on that map. A large workforce lived in these camps, black and white, of course segregated. In 1881, the canal was under the command of Major William R. King, and I don't have a photo of Assistant Engineer Gallo, but this is Major William R. King in charge of the Muscle Shoals Canal project in 1881. And here are some slides of the Muscle Shoals Canal from the 1870 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers during the construction. And most of the canal, as you know, it runs parallel to the shoreline of Lauderdale County. Most of it is underwater now. Since the Wilson Dam went in the 1920s, it's mostly all flooded. But it was a way to lock ships over the Muscle Shoals. You couldn't get steamboats over the rapids or the shoals in the water, so they built the canal. So here's some more views of the canal under construction. And that's what it would look like when there was a dummy railroad line, as they called it, that ran alongside. So you had a railroad track, and then you had the actual canal itself. And Nicholas Wynn wrote a book called Life with the Canalers about 35, 40 years ago. He grew up as the son of people that worked on the Muscle Shoals Canal. His father had been a lockmaster. So they used the Muscle Shoals Canal until Wilson Dam was completed. Whoops, sorry, that's me. I should have turned that off. So this, let's see. Yeah, we see that one. So it was used until the Wilson Dam was completed. So this is Lieutenant, or later Captain George W. Goethals, and a view, a tinted postcard view of Lot 9 of the Muscle Shoals Canal after it was completed. It was a marvel. It was a marvel of engineering at that time. It's amazing what they were able to achieve between 1875 and 1890. No longer than that it took to do all of that. And then this is a steamboat in the aqueduct at Muscle Shoals from around 1906 or so. And this is a slide of Alexander George Smith, who was a native of Elgin, Scotland, and a resident of Tuscumbia, who, with the exception of 8 months in 1878, had been working for the U.S. Engineering Department since February of 1875 on the Muscle Shoals Canal. At the time of the robbery in March 1881, he was receiver of materials for the Blue Water Division. His job duties entailed secretarial work for Assistant Engineer Henry J. Gallo, in charge of the division, as well as serving as what we would call the paymaster. In 1884, Smith married Miss Lizzie Glenn, sister of future Florence Mayor R. Lee Glenn. In May of 1895, Mr. Smith was transferred to Riverton in northwest Colbert County, where he was made chief clerk on the Colbert Shoals Canal, and most of Riverton was flooded to make the lake. Smith died Friday, May 26, 1900, at just 50 years old after a 4-year illness. His Florence Times obituary noted his 1881 robbery by the James Gang. I know you can't read that, but they noted that he had been robbed by the infamous James Gang. Well, at the time, nobody knew or realized, Smith certainly didn't, that he had just been robbed by the James Gang. He did, in his deposition, which several of the newspapers recounted, he described the outlaws. He said, number one, height about 5 feet 8 inches, weight about 165 pounds, heavy-set, broad-faced, girty, sandy colored beard and hair, age about 30 to 36 years, scar on upper lip near middle, general respectable appearance, wore dark pantaloons and slouch hat. He carried a gold watch, rode dark bay horse with a white star or spot in face, had a wavy mane and tail. The second outlaw, according to Smith, height about 5 feet 10 inches, weight 140 to 150 pounds, pale, thin visage, light sandy mustache and chin whiskers, aged about 30 years, sallow looking and consumptive, blue eyes with a good deal of white, wore dark overcoat and slouch hat, rode a sorrel horse with 4 white feet. And the third outlaw, Smith described, quote, height about 5 feet 10 inches, weight about 140 pounds, heavyset dark eyes, dark brown mustache and chin whiskers, about 28 years old, wore full suit of dark brown clothes, a sack coat and slouch hat, rode a dapple gray horse about 15 and a half hands high, had what I think was a Texas saddle, talked with a kind of brogue like an Irishman. And no one knew it at the time, but the outlaws were Jesse Woodson James, Irishman William Bill Whiskey Head Bill Ryan, and possibly Dick Little or Wood Height. Most historians now think it actually was Dick Little. So most historians believe that Frank James was not involved in that robbery. However, after the fact, people thought that he was. It is contested by many historians whether Alexander Franklin and Frank James participated in this robbery or not. The James gang had been hiding out with their families in Nashville and using aliases since about 1878. Jesse lived with his family on the Jeff Hyde farm and worked for the Indiana Lumber Company and then for the Lambert Locker Barrel Factory, while Frank, Annie, and their new son Robert Franklin lived on the Josiah Walton farm, then the Felix Smith farm. Frank's alias was Benjamin J. Woodson. Jesse, whose alias was John David Howard, may also have taught a Sunday school class while they were there. While in Nashville, Jesse and his wife Z lost twin sons to death, and Jesse suffered a bout of malaria. While in Nashville, Jesse also raced horses, and Frank raised prize-winning Poland China hogs. Tom Ryan's alias was Tom Hill. And since the James gang were masters of disguise, and few people had ever seen a picture of them, they weren't able to immediately connect the dots. So nobody really had ever seen photos of the James gang at that time. Wanted posters at that time typically did not have photos of the outlaws on them, just a physical description. So, and nobody really knew what they looked like. And it was probably Dick Little and Whiskey Head Bill Ryan that rounded out the gang along with Jesse. And on the order of Assistant Engineer H.J. Gallo, Canal employee Daniel Comer left camp at Blue Water on Saturday, March 12, 1881, the morning after the robbery, striking the outlaws back into Tennessee, finally returning to camp on April 16th without the robbers in custody. And if anybody knows Greg Gresham, who's one of our Civil War Roundtable board members, he is a descendant of Daniel Comer, and I have Daniel's testimony that he gave his deposition. Comer tracked the outlaws from the German colony of St. Joseph, Tennessee in Lawrence County, to Chinubby Store, to West Point, to Waynesboro in Wayne County, to Linden in Perry County, then to Perryville, then to Clifton in Wayne County, over to Scotts Hill in Henderson County. However, he concluded he was on the wrong trail, thus returned to St. Joseph on March 28th and up the Old Nazi Trace Road to Laurel Hill Factory, thence to Newburgh, then to Union Valley, and to Nashville, where he quote-unquote met the prisoner, and we'll see that in a minute. Comer finally traveled to Bellevue, Ashland City, and Kingston City with no success. So he returned via Center Star, where Smith had been released, to Blue Water on April 16th. And Comer noted that, quote, the men did not excite any suspicions except that Mr. Rails when they were going north. They pretended all through to be revenue officers, unquote. And the map on the screen shows the route that the outlaws took when they came down from Nashville and then back up to Nashville. Center Star should be a little bit further south than he's got it on this map. Maybe Florence ought to be a little bit more north. Now Florence is about right. Center Star needs to be closer to Florence. But anyway, so they turned Smith loose at Center Star, and then they went back to Nashville. which again, keep that timeline in your head. In the back of your mind. On April 1st, 1881, the Tuscumbia, North Alabamian, edited by Captain Arthur H. Keller, Helen Keller's dad, reported that the leader of the gang, they thought was the leader of the gang, Tom Hill, who'd robbed Receiver Smith, had been arrested in Nashville carrying $1,400 in gold and paper money. The man had entered a saloon at White's Creek near Nashville and ordered raw oysters and whiskey. As author Leland Johnson says, quote, with predictable results. Soon gloriously drunk and making a nuisance of himself, Hill, aka Ryan, started boasting that he was a robber and pulled a pistol on a customer. It took several strong men to disarm and subdue him. Davidson County, Tennessee Constable William W.L. Earthman confiscated 2 nickel-plated revolvers, 75 cartridges, and a diamond ring and fancy gold watch off of Ryan. At the jail, authorities discovered some $1,400 in gold and paper money on him. Smith, accompanied by Major King, went to Nashville to ID the guy, who turned out to be Whiskey Head Bill Ryan. Smith recognized Ryan by his Irish brogue immediately. He was the third guy that had the brogue. Ryan sang like a canary and turned on Frank and Jesse, explaining how they had planned and executed the robbery. He may have been there, but it wasn't his fault. Frank and Jesse were the brains behind it. So this is that damned Irishman, Whiskey Head Bill Ryan. On October 22nd, 1881, the grand jury for the Northern District of Alabama indicted Ryan for his part in the robbery. However, Alabama authorities allowed Ryan to be extradited back to Missouri, where they had felt he had a better chance of being convicted for previous robberies. So that's his indictment out of the file that Ronald Pettis gave us. In April of 1882, James gang member in April of 1882, James gang member James Andrew Dick Little turned state's evidence against Frank and Jesse, and in September of 1882 was himself tried in district court in Huntsville, charged with being an accomplice to the robbery of Smith. Jesse's widow, Zerelda Amanda Z. Mims James, went to Huntsville to testify against Little. Dick was found guilty by the judge of participating in the robbery, but the judge delayed sentencing in order to get him to testify against Frank. Jesse, of course, was dead at this time, being shot by Bob Ford in Missouri on April 3rd, 1882. So Jesse was not ever indicted for this robbery because he was deceased by that time. So this is a slide of Dick Little and Z. James, who was also Jesse James's first cousin, and his wife. Frank James surrendered in October of 1882. He was extradited from Missouri to Huntsville, Alabama, and stood trial in a U.S. District Court at Huntsville, Alabama on April 17, 1884. If convicted, he faced a 2-year prison sentence or a $10,000 fine. In one of the local papers that carried Frank James's appearances in court was the North Alabamian, edited by Helen Keller's dad, Captain Arthur H. Keller. And referring to a previous murder that Frank James supposedly committed, Captain Keller said, if Frank was involved in that murder, or if he was present when any other citizen was killed by his Confederates, his neck should be summarily broken, and we hope no effort will be spared to ascertain whether or not he is guilty. So Captain Keller in the North Alabamian was under no bones about what he wanted done with Frank if he was guilty, which is interesting because Captain Keller being a former Confederate officer and Frank being a former Confederate. Anyway, Captain Keller made no bones about it. So this is an article talking from the Huntsville Independent, pointing to Frank's upcoming trial. This was from Thursday, April 10th, 1884, noting that he's about to be arraigned and stand trial. And this is the Calhoun House, which used to be in Huntsville. It's not there anymore, but there is a historical marker on the spot. The photo of the house is from 1888, and they used it as a federal courthouse to try Frank James on April 17, 1884. Frank was incarcerated in the Huntsville jail, but was treated more like a visiting celebrity than a prisoner, being allowed to have guards in his, being allowed to have guests in his cell. They let him go quail hunting. He gave interviews to reporters at the Seagull Hotel. Several prominent residents also hosted him at dinner parties. Annie and son Robert stayed at Seagull's Hotel and sat in the audience each day of the trial to foster sympathy for Frank, which probably wasn't necessary, as many locals already considered Frank a folk hero. Indeed, Frank knew this, and he wrote to a friend of his and former counsel from another trial, William Rush, quote, "I have not an enemy in town so far as I have heard. Everyone is talking for me, especially the ex-Confederates and Southern Methodists," Frank was a Methodist, "have high spirits and feel as I will be acquitted." So Frank was sure he was going to get off because of all the ex-Confederate sympathy and the fact that he was a good Methodist, and so were a lot of the good townsfolk of Huntsville. Yet while pretending to love Huntsville and its people, in a letter dated March 6, 1881, Frank secretly wrote, quote, "I have told them they can all go to the devil. We have always said that the meanest people on earth live south, and we was not wrong about it either." So his public sentiments and private sentiments about the good folk of Huntsville were two different things. Well, Judge Harry Bruce was the presiding judge. Frank was represented by former Confederate General Leroy Pope Walker and Richard Walker of Huntsville, whereas R.B. Sloan and James W. Newman of Nashville and Winchester, Tennessee, and James W. Newman of Nashville and Winchester, Tennessee, respectively. U.S. District Attorney William H. Smith, former Republican governor of Alabama, represented the U.S. government, and L.W. Day read the indictment. Chief witnesses for the prosecution were Alexander George Smith, the receiver of materials, Dick Little, one of the James gang, Lauderdale County resident Thomas H. Peaton, A.G. Hill, Hugh Riley, who I also believe was from Lauderdale County, J.W. Davis, and Ian Wilcoxon. There were about 20 witnesses total. The only government witness to implicate Frank James was Dick Little, who obviously had an ulterior motive for doing so. Several local papers, including the Huntsville Independent and the Florence Gazette, covered the trial. Jesse's widow, Zerelda Z. James, was a witness for the defense. The only evidence for a conspiracy to rob receiver of material Smith back in 1881 was provided by Andrew James Dick Little. However, having admitted to being convicted of horse stealing in Missouri in 1874, defense counsel objected to Little's credibility as a witness. One of Esquire Sloan's, quote, good Irish witticisms was that if Dick Little had been present when Richard III on the field of Bosworth cried, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," Dick would have replied, "Don't be troubled, I will steal you one in a minute." So they thought they had Dick Little pegged. Since he's a convicted criminal, you can't believe anything he says. Also, Frank had several witnesses who put him in Nashville the day of the robbery. Judge Bailey Brown of Nashville testified that B.J. Woodson, a.k.a. Frank James, had been in his courtroom in Nashville on March 11th. Black detective Jim Smith saw Woodson between March 8 to 12 in Nashville. Nashvilleian W.H. Spann claimed to have purchased some hogs from Woodson. Blacksmith Jonas Taylor, who had known Woodson and Howard, Jesse, since 1878 and even owned 2 racehorses with Jesse as Howard, produced his daybook and account ledger showing that on March 11, 1881, Taylor had shoed a horse for B.J. Woodson, Frank James, and the next day, March 12, James paid Taylor the $100.25 owed him. The prosecution argued that Taylor's account books had been altered, however. It was ultimately of no avail, and Frank James was acquitted. No sooner had the jury foreman read the verdict than someone in the courtroom let loose with a rebel yell, and the courtroom broke into thunderous applause, which one of the Huntsville newspapers said was shameless that they could do that in a courtroom. So these are two images of newspaper accounts talking about the acquittal from the Florence Gazette and the Lawrenceburg Press. And Mr. Joseph Ackland of Lauderdale County was one of the jurors and reported that the jury was out for 5 hours but only took 2 ballots. 3 of the jurors at first voted guilty but were persuaded to vote not guilty by the other jurymen. And at that time it was only males that could serve on juries. They had to be 21 years old and property owners. Walker may have played the Confederate veteran sympathy card since Frank was an ex-Confederate, and some of the jurors may have been as well. There is some speculation among some historians that Frank's defense team may have played the ex-Confederate card. I don't think he really needed to, because there was no way he was going down for that under the circumstances. Well, on May 2nd, 1881, U.S. Marshal Captain Arthur H. Keller, editor of the Tuscumbia North Alabamian, commenting on the case, wrote in part, quote, "After a careful perusal of the evidence, we believe that the redoubtable Frank was present in propria persona and got his share of the swag. And yet we have no doubt but that some at least of the jury had the reasonable doubt that cleared it." So editor Keller thought that Frank was guilty, but some of the jurors had the reasonable doubt. 2 sheriffs, one from Missouri and the other from Minnesota, were waiting to arrest Frank for robberies in their states. However, the Missouri sheriff was just a little bit quicker, and he got to him first, so Frank was taken back to Missouri, but wound up being pardoned by the governor of Missouri. Now, after his Missouri pardon, Frank and his family lived in various locations such as Missouri, Oklahoma, Nevada, and Texas, and Frank worked at a variety of odd jobs, such as selling shoes and dry goods, raising horses, starting races, and he even worked at a burlesque house for a while. For a little bit, in 1903, he was a member of the James Younger Wild West show. He eventually retired to his mother's home place in Kearney, Missouri, where he charged 50 cents admission to tourists. And you can see a tinted postcard of Frank standing in front of the James house in Texas. James Farm, Kodak's Bar, no cameras, no photos. Home of the James, Jesse and Frank Outlaws, admission 50 cents per person. And Frank also went around on speaking engagements to children's groups like the YMCA, warning young, good Christian men, don't do what I did, don't become an outlaw, it's really not a good life. But he tried to go respectable. Well, in the years since the robbery, there has been tons of folklore about the Jesse and Frank James robbery. One bit of folklore that was actually turned into a small book is The James Boys Rode South, a thrilling and authentic new episode in the fabulous lives of the most daring desperados of modern times, Frank and Jesse James and their comrades in crime, by Professor W. Stanley Hoole of the University of Alabama. He wrote this little book, which we have in our Jesse and Frank James file, and he claimed to have interviewed people who were alive back in the 1880s that could talk about this, people that knew people that were alive in the 1880s that would talk about this. In this little 1955 book, Professor Hoole pieced together a story he'd been told that before the March 11th, 1881 Muscle Shoals robbery, the James brothers traveled to Selma, Alabama to visit a friend staying in the St. James Hotel in Selma. He then recounted the story of Frank's 1884 trial in Huntsville. And he pretty much says this is folklore, it's probably not true, but it's some good stories. And it's the first time I had ever heard that the James gang actually made it as far as Selma in Alabama. Again, it's probably just folklore, and he admits that, but it's an interesting read. But there's all kind of folklore about this robbery and about the James gang in general. This is an article when Frank James robbed a bank in Florence. On November 11th, 1959, Mr. George McIntyre of Decatur, formerly of Florence, recounted a story to the Florence Times about the day Frank and Jesse robbed the Florence bank. According to McIntyre, he moved to Florence in 1881, quote, "It was watermelon time," unquote, when the outlaws came down Court Street and robbed Campbell and Company's bank. Quote, "I remember it as if it were yesterday," unquote, McIntyre said of the alleged bank robbery. McIntyre said he also remembered the robbery of receiver of material Smith as well, which he incorrectly said occurred at Lock 6 instead of Lock 5. And if you read about this robbery nowadays, it usually always has it happening at Lock 6, but it was actually near Douglas's branch at Lock 5. Mr. McIntyre had the outlaws riding up Huntsville Road at 8:30 a.m. one day and stopping at the McIntyre home on nearby Price Road to ask Mr. McIntyre's father, an employee at Lock 6 who was home that day clearing the fence row, how to get to Lock 6. Again, it was Lock 5. There was no robbery, no recorded robbery of Campbell and Company's bank, and the robbery of the receiver of materials occurred near Lock 5, not 6. Some Huntsville residents claim that the James gang robbed a bank in Huntsville, but this too is just folklore. There was never any banks robbed in Huntsville by the James gang. Well, on September 6, 1962, the Florence Herald, back at this time, the Florence Herald did what they call personality sketches of interesting Florentines, and they did one, a personality sketch of Mr. John H. Williams, a native of Lexington, Alabama, who, according to the paper, claimed to remember seeing Jesse and Frank James, quote, ride through town on their way to their meeting with the paymaster Alex Smith, unquote. The Lauderdale News of March 16, 1881 did report that the outlaws had followed Smith into town and watched him withdraw the money from Campbell and Company's bank. Left town after Smith did, yet, quote, by some means were ahead of him when he reached Lock 7. So they had it as even at Lock 7. So it's theoretically possible that he may have been able to observe some suspicious characters lurking around the bank that followed the paymaster out of Florence. But again, this is just folklore and it can't really be documented. I'm not accusing Mr. Williams of fibbing. I'm sure he really thought that he had seen the outlaws as a younger man. Finally, there's another good story. This is the tombstone of Richard L. Davis of Rogersville in Lauderdale County. Allegedly, Jesse hid out with the Davis family of Rogersville after pulling the Muscle Shoals robbery and had his way with a teenage Nancy Margaret Eastep, who was later married to a man named Davis and later married to a man named Wilson. Richard Davis's mother. The only problem is that Margaret Eastep was 35 in 1880, enumerated in the census as the single daughter of Thomas and Nancy Eastep of Rogersville. She married Richard L. Davis on March 10, 1881. Richard died and Margaret married Hugh J. Wilson in 1894. Richard is buried in the Hurricane Cemetery at Rogersville. But the 35-year-old Margaret was married the day before the robbery, and none of the period accounts of the robbery have the gang anywhere near Rogersville. If you remember, they rode with Smith up to Center Star, let him go, and then they headed straight back to Tennessee. So the teenage mother, or the teenage girl was actually a widowed mother of two who was 35 years old in 1881 at the time of the robbery. So don't really see that happening. The age works out for Richard Davis. I mean, it works out, the math works out, but there's no evidence that they were ever anywhere near Rogersville. And this is Mrs. Nancy Margaret Eastep's 1880. You can't really read that, I know, but it shows Margaret as 35 years old in 1880. And then by 1900, she's married to Hugh J. Wilson. And Richard Davis is listed as Hugh's stepson. Finally, we have Richard L. Davis's death certificate filled out by his widow, Mrs. R. L. Davis of Lawrenceburg. And he says that his father's name was Richard L. Davis on his death certificate, and his mother was Margaret Eastep. Death certificates are not, as Chris can attest, are not always 100% reliable unless they're filled out by the next of kin, which this was. And his wife was in probably a pretty good vantage point to know who his parents were. So anyway, I just offer that. It's kind of like Mythbusters. So if I'm busting anybody's myths, I apologize. My favorite one of my favorite ones is this one. Will the real, several Colbert and Franklin County families claim kinship with the James brothers, who they claim hid out with their families after the robbery. However, as we saw, the gang headed straight back to Nashville after pulling the Muscle Shoals robbery. And I actually had a lady call me In 1999, a lady called me at the old library in Florence and requested information on the paymaster robbery because she had the safe the outlaws took from the paymaster's office. And I had to tell her that the outlaws never went near the office, but robbed Smith on horseback. And I doubt that he had a 1-ton safe strapped to the back of his horse. And as we saw, he had the money in an inside coat pocket and in saddlebags on the horse. And the lady goes, "Oh, what, you mean my grandparents lied?" And I'm like, no, they probably really thought he had that they had the vintage safe that came from the robbery. But it couldn't have been the safe from the paymaster's office because they robbed Smith on horseback from his pockets and saddlebags. One of my favorite pieces of folklore is this, which I call, "Will the real Alexander Franklin James please stand up?" after that TV show To Tell the Truth from the 70s. I'm old enough to remember that. Another legend says that Frank James and Lauderdale County resident and dry goods merchant Francis M. Frank Perry were one and the same man. Ironically, Alexander G. Smith was Frank Perry's brother-in-law. So the man that got robbed was Frank Perry's brother-in-law. People in Oakland in southwest Lauderdale County remembered that Perry settled in Lauderdale County in 1866 from Beersheba Springs, Tennessee, and made a lot of money very quickly because he was a shrewd businessman, and simply assumed that he was Frank James because they knew Frank James had been in Tennessee when he pulled the robbery and got a lot of money really quickly. So they assumed that these two guys were one and the same guy. And of course, Frank probably wasn't even in on the robbery. Frank Perry died January 3rd, 1929, and is buried in the Florence City Cemetery with family members. And if anybody in here knows Betty Champion and her mother, the late Mrs. Liz Gerber, they're relatives of Frank Perry. And when they first heard that he might be Frank James, they said, "This is the funniest thing we've ever heard. We've never heard this before." And there's some people at Oakland used to take this really seriously. So Perry died in 1929. He's buried in the Florence City Cemetery near his relatives, Alexander G. Smith and the Glenn family, who was mayor of Florence. Frank James died February 18th, 1915, and his wife Annie had his remains cremated, stored in a vault until her death, and finally buried in Missouri next to her. She was afraid that his grave would become some kind of relic for people, or that they might try to in some way disturb it. So she had him cremated and his ashes stored in a vault until her death, when they were buried together. Yet this fact did not stop the folklore, as a final story has it that Frank James died in the 1890s and is buried just outside Lawrence County, Tennessee. So some Lawrence County, Tennessee people will tell you that Frank James is buried outside Lawrenceburg and died in the 1890s. The little guy came in the library 20 years ago in an old building, and he was shocked when I told him that Frank was cremated and buried in Missouri. Really? I'm pretty sure all the biographies agree that he's buried in Missouri next to his wife. She died in 1944. He was buried, his ashes were buried next to her. But, that doesn't stop a good folklore. So if anybody has stories they want to tell our digital archivist that we can record, or just write them down and put them in our Jesse James file, these stories are important. People tell them for a reason. And they obviously thought they were genuine. Even if, there's not really any evidence for some, they're really interesting stories. And finally, back in 2006 in Huntsville, Theater Huntsville did a play called The Trial of Frank James, written by Jeff Robertson. I don't know if they still do it or have done it since then, but there are scenes from that play that I didn't have a chance to go see. It looked interesting. I don't know how historically accurate it was, but anyway, that's all I have for this program. If anybody's got any quick questions I can answer, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Otherwise, I'll turn it back over to Chris.